Hey everybody, welcome to Period 4, Jackson and Federal Power. This is lesson 4.8. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the causes and the effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government from 1800 to 1848. So to begin, we're going to rewind back to the first party system, which emerged at the beginning of the new nation and divided America into two political camps. The Federalists, who represented the commercial elite in the northern part of the country, and the Republicans, who represented the working class farmers and planters of the South and the West. As we learned earlier, the Federalist Party would disappear following the War of 1812 and the Republican Party would divide. One of those divisions becomes the Democratic Party, which was led by Andrew Jackson. Democrats were strong advocates of states' rights over federal power, and they opposed Henry Clay's American system, which was his economic plan to use federal power to unite the country into one integrated economic system. The Republicans who remained opposed Jackson and the Democrats called themselves National Republicans, led by Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, and the National Republicans supported the strong national government and supported Clay's American system. We see the clash of these two views when the Bank War comes about, testing Andrew Jackson's views on the limited power of the presidency. Andrew Jackson campaigned as the Democratic candidate for president against the Bank of the United States, which was a vital part of Henry Clay's American system. Jackson went as far to refer to the bank as the monster, because that resonated with his voters in the common man, who opposed the bank because they felt it only served the interests of the commercial elite, and that a lot of the investors in the bank were foreigners who were profiting off American citizens' tax dollars. Jackson promised his supporters as president he would destroy the bank. So Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams decide to set a trap for Andrew Jackson. They introduce legislation into Congress to do what's called a recharter, or a relicensing of the Bank of the United States, which Congress periodically has to do for institutions that it creates. However, Clay and Adams did the recharter years before it was required because they wanted to put that piece of legislation on President Andrew Jackson's desk and force him to sign it before he had to run for re-election. Their hope was Jackson knew that the bank was essential for the American economy and would have no choice but to sign it into law. But by doing so, he would betray his promise to his voters, and in 1832, the common man would turn against Jackson and he would lose control of the presidency. So Jackson, fully aware of their plan, when he got the legislation for the early recharter, didn't hesitate, and he issued a veto called the Bank Veto, which destroyed the recharter of the Bank of the United States. He didn't veto the bank per se, he just vetoed that attempt to renew the bank when it was going to expire. The bank veto proved to be hugely popular with Jackson's supporters, and he won a landslide victory and a second term in office. The bank veto, however, will have significant impacts on American history. First of all, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams will form the Whig Party. The Whigs are a new political party. It replaces the National Republicans, which didn't last very long. And the Whigs took their name from a British political party that was in opposition to the king. So by calling themselves the Whigs, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams were labeling Andrew Jackson as a tyrannical monarch and a king in the United States. The second impact, as I mentioned, was Jackson won a landslide victory in 1832. His supporters turned out and supported him and his veto of the bank charter. Clay and Adams and the head of the bank used some of the bank's resources to campaign against Jackson in 1832. They weren't real successful at it, obviously, but it made Jackson angry enough that when he was reelected, he decided he was going to kill the bank early. He wasn't going to let it die a slow death in a couple years. So Jackson ordered all federal money taken out of the Bank of the United States and placed into individual banks that were run at the state level. His opponents called those his pet banks. And Jackson defunded the bank. And when he did so, the bank collapsed early because it had no revenue. What an unintended consequence of that was in 1837, the collapse of the bank led to the Panic of 1837, the first significant economic downturn in the history of the United States. It was up there with the Great Depression as far as upheaval to the American economy because of Jackson's destruction of the bank. The Panic of 1837 didn't impact Jackson as much because by then he had left office, but it left his successor, Martin Van Buren, with a real problem on his hands. Another issue that Jackson had to deal with was called the Nullification Crisis. And in South Carolina, a southern state, Democratic state, Jackson's party, there was an opposition to the tariff that was part of the American system. And that tariff, if you remember, placed a high tax on imports, which made goods more expensive in the United States. So South Carolina passed a law saying that they had the right to nullify the tariff, which meant they would declare it void within South Carolina's borders because they felt it was unconstitutional, and they would not collect the tariff, nor would they allow the federal government to do it. And they asserted a principle called states' rights, that the states have the right to review and determine what federal actions are constitutional. It was a highly controversial decision, and it was setting the United States up for a potential civil war. The irony of South Carolina's decision to embrace nullification and states' rights was the proclamation they made that declared that was written by John Calhoun, who was not only Jackson's vice president, but Calhoun had strongly been an ally of Clay and John Quincy Adams as a Whig. And this was one of the biggest flip-flops in American history, as Calhoun, a nationalist, found himself on the sides of states' rights and completely changed his political allegiance. So the crisis approaches civil war as Jackson is determined that he is going to collect the tariffs in South Carolina. And he goes to Congress and he pressures them to pass the Force Bill, which is a law that gives the president to use the U.S. military within the boundaries of the United States if federal law wasn't being enforced. And Jackson, in essence, planned to send the army in, and he very publicly said he was going to arrest the South Carolina legislature, arrest the governor, and collect the tariff, as was his right. This action was surprising because Jackson long had been a states' rights person. He believed in limited national government, a limited power of the presidency. And here he is at the national level telling the state that he was going to invade and take over. But Jackson was afraid if South Carolina began nullification and asserted states' rights, other states would follow, and the Union, as they called the United States, would crumble. It'd be like a sweater that came undone, and each state would be asserting its own authority, and the federal government would just collapse. And Jackson wasn't about to allow that on his watch. So when it looked like South Carolina was ready to resist the Force Bill, Henry Clay, the great compromiser who did the Missouri Compromise in 1820, steps in again and he negotiates a compromise tariff in which the tariff will be collected in South Carolina at a lower rate, which favored South Carolina. But Nullification was taken off the table. South Carolina walked away from their claim that they had the right of nullification, which appeased Jackson. So once again, we had Clay get us out of a national crisis that was coming off of this conflict. Jackson faced a third crisis when it came to Native Americans in a federal policy called Indian removal, which was where the federal government would, at the time, allow Native American nations to trade their land in the East for land in what was called Indian Territory, is now called Oklahoma. So this crisis over Indian removal popped up in Georgia, where the Cherokee people were located. And the Georgia people discovered gold on the Cherokee land. They held several hundreds of thousands of acres in Georgia, and the Georgians wanted to get the gold off that land. So the Cherokee refused to go. Georgia went to Congress and said, you have to do something to help us get rid of these people. So Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which allowed the federal government and state militias to use force to remove Native American nations from their lands if they will not voluntarily go. So Indian removal went from a voluntary process to now a process that was being done at gunpoint. The Cherokee went to the Supreme Court claiming they were a sovereign nation and protected by treaties. And in the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall sided with the Cherokees in the case of Worcester versus Georgia. He said that the federal government could not force them off those lands. So it was a victory for the Cherokee people, but it was a hollow victory because Andrew Jackson refused to enforce that decision. He actually said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. In other words, Jackson was refusing to use his executive authority to enforce a judicial decision. The Cherokee remained in Georgia, a bulk of them did, and they refused to leave their land, whereas other Indian nations in the Southeast were removed under the Indian Removal Act. When the Cherokee refused to go, Jackson and his successor, Martin Van Buren, sent the U.S. military in to drive out the Native people who remained in the Southeast. That journey, that 5,000-mile journey in which Native people were rounded up, put in stockades, animal pens, and then forced to march by the U.S. Army through wintertime from Georgia to Oklahoma is called the Trail of Tears. It's a name that Native people don't use to describe it because they feel it makes them seem as weak, but historians have applied that term to the sadness of the situation. In the end, the Native people were removed from the East, but over 60,000 Native people lost their claims on the land that was entitled to them by treaty, and 16,000 Native people died on the Trail of Tears due to the brutal conditions, including 25% of the Cherokee Nation. So by the end of this lesson, hopefully you have been able to explain the causes and effects of policy debates, whether we're talking about state and national power and the Nullification Crisis or the Bank War or the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, and how the different groups and different parties reacted to this. Thanks a lot and have a great day.